Hello, my yarny friends. I'm Sara Sach. Welcome or welcome back to another edition of this or that, and sometimes the other thing. Well, today our subject is shell stitches. And I decided to go ahead and discuss this because I had someone contact me and tell me that the thing I was calling a simple shell stitch was not a simple shell stitch. And I asked them, so, why is it not? Who told you this? Blah, blah, blah. And it come to find out she was a designer that had just recently started doing crochet designs and had confused the idea that a shell stitch and a shell stitch crochet pattern are the same thing, but they're actually two different things. You can use all different kinds of shell stitches within a shell stitch crochet pattern. Okay, and so what we're going to talk about today is the fact that there are a gazillion, types of shell stitches and shell stitch crochet patterns. So I decided to ask my Google search, how many types of shell stitches are there? And this is what it said. There isn't a single defined number of types of crochet shell stitches, but rather a wide variety of variations based on stitch height and stitch width, the number of stitches, the stitch that's used, single, double, half, triple, and a list goes on. Because there is an innumerable number of types of shell stitches. And there is an uncountable number of patterns that uses shell stitches. For instance, you can use shell stitches throughout a pattern. You could use it just for the trim and lots of other ways. And depending on which stitches you use, single, half, double, double, triple, depends on what the shell stitch looks like, or how tall it is, or how wide it is, by how many of those stitches that you use. Also, there is an open shell stitch, which means there's chain ones in between those stitches. And so, like I said, there are a gazillion types of shell stitches. I'm going to do a demo over here of just a few to kind of give you an understanding of what I'm talking about. So I'm going to use this swatch that I had on hand that I've used in a couple other of our this and that videos. And so what I'm going to do first of all is talk about height. All right, so a shell stitch can be a single crochet. So let's skip the first one. I've chained one there, and we'll go in the next one, and we're going to stitch three single crochet stitches to make a single crochet shell stitch. So there's a simple 3 single crochet shell stitch. Well, maybe we want it a little bit taller. All right, so we're going to skip the next one, and then in the next we're going to do 3 half double crochets. 1, 2, 3. See, it gets just a little bit taller. All right, well, let's skip 2 and do some double crochet stitches. And again, the stitch gets taller. But let's say we want it to be a wider shell. All right, so maybe I want to do 5 double crochets in the same stitch or space. Okay, and so it ended up taller and wider. Okay, a lot of people want to call this a simple shell stitch. It's okay if you want to. I don't care. I just call them shell stitches. All right, well, let's skip 3. And we're going to do triple shell stitches. And I'm skipping the amount because I want to have room. So we're going to wrap twice, go in that same stitch, and make our triple shell stitch. And different heights of shell stitches can be used for different types of things. All right, I'm doing 5 triple shell stitches. And so what we can see here is they get taller, and if we add more shell stitches in that same stitch or space, it gets wider. Another thing that you can do if you want there to be space is to chain 1 or 2, skip, and then make your shell stitches. And I'm just going to do a simple double crochet shell stitch with 3 double crochets. Okay, and that will make a more lacy shell stitch. See, it puts distance between. Okay, now another thing we talked about is an open shell stitch, and there's 2 ways of doing that. One way they call a double V stitch, where you stitch 2 double crochets. You may chain 1 or 2 depending on what the pattern calls for, and then you stitch 2 more. And this has been referred to as the double V stitch because you're doing a V stitch, but you're doing 2 double crochets instead of 1. And we'll talk more about V stitches in a later video. That is one I do have planned. All right, now another way, let me see how much yarn I have. Okay, another way that you can do an open, which I love to do because it makes it nice and lacy, is to do a triple open shell stitch. I'm going to go ahead and skip 3. We're going to triple crochet in that next stitch, and we're going to chain 1. Sometimes they'll chain 2 or 3 if they want it really open for the pattern that they're doing. And what this does is it puts an open space in between the stitches, and you can do this stitch for a single, a half double, a double, a triple, a quadruple, as many as you want to. And you can do as many double crochets as your pattern calls for. And this is the reason that I say there are so many different types of shell stitches, and it has so many different types of techniques. Single, half double, double, triple, and of course we can go on with double triples and all the tallest stitches that they get. We can chain between to spread them out, and of course you would skip more stitches to spread them out. I just tried to get it all on the top of this one swatch. And then we have what's called the double V, which is also an open shell stitch because we chained 1, and sometimes they'll chain 2 or 3 in there. And then of course the basic open shell stitch, which places a chain or 2 and sometimes 3 in between whatever stitch we're doing. And like I said, you can do this for single, half, double, triple, and you get lots of wonderful techniques for that. It makes a nice, really pretty open and lacy stitch. Okay, and so these are some of the basic shell stitches that we use. And so you can see it's really difficult to say just use a shell stitch because there are so many different variations to it. And a lot of times when you're reading a pattern, it'll just say shell stitch. And so what I like to do in my patterns when I'm writing them, where I put the list of stitches, I might put shell stitch or open shell stitch and then the abbreviation. And then after that, I will write what I want you to do or type. I may say 4 double crochets in the same stitch or space, or 12 double crochets or 12 triples, depending on whatever shell stitch that I'm doing. And so what I try to do is on my written patterns where I have the list of stitches listed, I'll put open shell stitch or shell stitch, I'll put the abbreviation, and then I'll give you a quick explanation, like it's explained in the pattern, and I'll have it written down in the pattern as we go. Or I'll put there on that description, I'll put 5 double crochets in the same stitch or space, or double crochet, chain 2 double crochet, chain 2 double crochet in the same stitch or space. I put that there just to give you just a little bit better understanding of what I'm looking for when we're making this particular crochet pattern that I'm, whichever one that we're working on. I know a lot of times, I always try to do pictures and photos, you know, so that you can see, and you can look at it usually and go, oh yeah, there's 3 shell stitches in there or whatever. But I want you to be able to understand it as you go and not have to like decipher a picture. You know what I'm saying? The picture's just so that you can see how it looks when it's done. But that's why I try to put an explanation. A lot of times if it's a tricky stitch, like maybe it's one of these triple ones that has open in between, and you're going to do like 6 triples with chain 2s in between or something, I will do an explanation of that. I do that a lot with cluster stitches also. I'll do an explanation under that, and it'll say special stitch, open, triple, cluster, something or whatever, you know, and then I'll give you an explanation of what that should be, you know, stitched out with just a few pictures. So I hope this has helped you not be confused when you see shell stitch or open shell stitch, that you get an understanding of what that refers to. And again, all these stitches can be used within a crochet pattern, and it can also be used on trims, hat bands, edges of scarves, all through scarves, any pattern, you know, that a pillow or a purse. A lot of them have shell stitches. Shell stitches are one of my favorite things to work with because there's just so much that you can do with it. And they always add a little extra, you know, touch. You can even make shell stitches ripple by adding a lot of stitches to cause the ripple to be a shell stitch. And so there's lots of different ways that you can use shell stitch. And so my goal in today's video was to take out the confusion. Shell stitches are fun. Now remember, I love to read your comments. They're very important to me, and I read them all. And I may not get a chance to give you a comment on every comment, but I do try to read every single one of them. And remember, if you have a question or just something that you want to give us a tip on, feel free to add that comment, because I love to learn new things too. Maybe some things you've used shells on, and you know, different patterns that you've used that you really liked. We like that too. Alrighty, so again, don't let shells confuse you. And remember, there are no wrong answers, no wrong questions. And if you ask a question and I don't know the answer, I will do my very best to find you an answer. Alrighty, so that's our this and that for today. And I'll see you next time.